niluto instead. Your old something.
Hello and welcome to Same Old News with your host Josh. Episode 7: News and Politics. Hello and welcome to Same Old News, the show which dissects the news press of the past and tries to find links to the present. More importantly, welcome to the final episode of this first season. In this first season, we've really brought in the introductory elements of this large project, what needs to be addressed, and how it can be related to the issues of the press in the present day. But after this episode, I will be taking a couple of months off to be scripting more new episodes, which focus more on the names and newspapers that make up my topic. And that takes a lot of time with research and fact-checking, etc. But let's not think about that. Let's get into today's episode where we'll be looking at the place of the news in politics, especially considering what we have spoken of in the last two episodes concerning revolutions and the press in empire. The final important strand to focus on is what the hell is going on in British politics in general in this period. To do this, we need to focus on a few key topics which are really well connected to our previous two episodes. Firstly, the concept of religions, then parties or political matters, and then the hot topic issue of the day of reform. No, not the party, the actual thing, the actual concept of reform. So, without further ado, let's get straight into this. So, religion. One key thing that comes to mind quite a lot in the minds of people when you ask them about this period would be technological advancement and the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. This is not necessarily wrong, but it is slightly misleading. I think it rushes too much into the ideas of capitalism and markets a bit too quickly. Mercantilism is still a dominant idea. Adam Smith had only just wrote The Wealth of Nations, and other big early economists like Ricardo haven't really come through yet in the late 18th century to evangelise economic thought. See Boyd Hilton's work for more on that idea. Rather, in this period, people are still living in pre-industrial societies. And it took us until the 1980s to really consider the continued centrality of religion to the average person living in the late 18th century. There was still a strong conception of church and state with the Anglican Church. But multiple strands of religion are popularly practiced or coming through, with Catholicism, Judaism, as well as smaller sects of Protestantism that are not Anglican or the Church of England. So Evangelicalism, Methodism, and Quakerism, but that last one is still growing at this time. Many of these strands of Protestantism were labelled dissenters. And we also have laws still in place which discriminated against religious faiths in the form of the Test and Corporation Acts. This is on top of rampant anti-Catholicism and anti-Semitism both in law and society of the period. Religion was still central to people's lives. James Sachs' research into conservative newspapers made an honestly really funny comment about this, which I'd like to paraphrase. Lots of conservative newspapers were church and king, pro-fusion of church and state, in line with the Anglican Church. So some of the pro-church and king papers wanted to push into the market share of the Sunday newspapers, which were dominated by the radical press. And Sack rather funnily says that most of these church and king Sunday papers failed because the people who would read pro-Anglican church and king papers were a bit occupied on the Lord's Day to be reading a newspaper. But in terms of British politics, questions were being raised about the concept of religious tolerance and allowing non-Anglican religious groups to be allowed to take up government positions. Before then, due to the Test Acts, which is a clue in the name by the way, it was a test on your religion before taking public office. If you were not a Church of England Protestant, well, you're not getting the job. This was especially so with the faiths of Catholicism and Judaism. Catholic enfranchisement didn't come in until 1829, which literally split the Tory party by the way, and Jewish enfranchisement didn't really come in until 1858. And what we see in this period is a large push from conservative elements of the press and politics who do not want to expand the franchise of religious groups. This is a constant issue. But a further thing about the centrality of religion in this period was that religion was constantly invoked in other political matters. The ideas of reform in a political sense was built on the terminology of the Reformation and reform with religious connotations. See Joanna Innes's work on this if you want to read more on the linguistic etymology of reform in this period. But speaking of religion in politics, we can now move on to politics itself, and especially the structure of the parties. The politics of the time was not necessarily dominated by the two-party system that we come to see in present politics, especially in countries like Britain and America. The party system, heavy quotation marks there, leading up to the period of 1780 to 1830, had been established after the Glorious Revolution of 1688, and a period of Whig dominance had appeared. There was not really a party system though, since there was not an established membership of parties. Rather, getting into power or politics, or even leading a group, was based on patronage of notable individuals. This is why during this period historians have spoken of political factions being named after patrons and not really being a party per se. So for example, the Rockinghamites, the Pittites, the Foxites, the Canningites, the Wellingtonians, etc, etc. This leads to an issue when identifying a conservative press. They're not necessarily supporting a party, but more reflect a general view of society which would span one or even overlap multiple factions and their differences. These differences were usually small and covered a few policy areas, especially religion for the Conservatives, over issues such as anti-Catholicism and the place of the Church in relation to the state. But the two general parties were the Whigs and the Tories. No, these Tories are not the Conservatives that we know today, they're actually two technically separate groups. But the Tory party is a predecessor of the Conservative Party, which is why the nickname for the Conservative Party today is the Tories. Now, many historians dispute the existence of a Tory party during this period, and I went over much of this in a previous episode. But just to refresh your memory, everyone in this period was generally a Whig in the sense that they supported the current line of succession of the Hanoverian line, which eventually became Saxe-Coburg-Gotha and then Windsor, which is the same one that we have in Britain to this very day. So the Tory party as an entity didn't really exist in the second half of the 18th century. There was backlash from their association with Jacobitism post-Glorious Revolution, which tarred their reputation and led to a Whig dominance for over half a century. The Tory party though re-emerged in the early 19th century after the death of William Pitt the Younger, at the time the Prime Minister. His centrality is important for bringing together disparate, generally counter-revolutionary and conservative factions into one large tent. It would be this conglomerate of factions that, after some infighting, would form the base of the Tory party as we entered the 1820s. Before it then collapsed again in the late 1820s, leading to the Conservative Party in the sort of 1840s. So, that's the Tories, but what about the Whigs? Well, once again, it's quite difficult to give a general definition to a party which was made up of disparate factions with quite varying ideas. As an example, William Pitt the Younger, despite now being seen as a Conservative, potentially even a Tory before the party returned, identified as a Whig. You also had Conservative-minded names in the Whig party like Edmund Burke himself. But then you had like a sort of direct opposite wing with names like Charles James Fox, one of the largest radical voices in Parliament, especially during the 1790s. Generally, it is hard to define these groups in the 18th century, so some historians like to use the ideas of a government and opposition party in this period, as it's a lot simpler to see politics in that framework. By the time the Napoleonic Wars ended though, we are seeing the development of what could reasonably be called a two-party system, as general political groups were now solidifying based on generally held beliefs and political principles. So that takes us into my final topic of today, the state of politics in this period, especially when taking into account these parties, or lack thereof, in relation to the hot button issue of the day, reform. Remember when I mentioned the Whig interpretation in the previous episode? Well, it's back and we've got to deal with it again. Generally in history, a term came about called the Age of Reform that was used to discuss the general period 1780 to 1850. Now, I am personally against this generous interpretation of the period, mainly because, frankly, yes, reforms did occur and the system was changing, but to see it as some form of linear line of progress is just offensively wrong. So let's look at some of the big reforms of this era, and let's see that linear line of progress that the Whig historians like to speak of. The repeal of the Corporation and Test Acts were generally good things, as it allowed people from non-establishment religious groups to enter politics. But those repeals didn't actually do anything for the Catholic and Jewish communities to enter politics. When those groups finally got some form of enfranchisement a bit further down the line, it didn't mean that they were suddenly not being discriminated anymore. Social outcasting and prejudice still remained, even to this day. Those prejudices were still socially ingrained in the population and can easily be seen in the art, literature, and political writing. So, a reform, but not really a reform at the same time. Next, we have the potentially biggest or most well-known reform of the period, the Great Reform Act of 1832. Now, it did do some good things for democracy. It got rid of the old system of rotten boroughs, which were seats filled with only maybe 10 eligible voters, so you could easily get a seat in Parliament even if you had not much of a base of support. Also, the Act redistributed the locations of seats to where the population actually was, so that they could get some representation. I know, it's insane, having MPs represent where you actually live, a mad idea. It also expanded the franchise. More people could vote, and that's good. And you're probably thinking, okay, what else? No, that's it. That's pretty much it. Now, that expansion of the franchise didn't actually give the vote to many people, it was just middle-class men. Workers didn't really get any representation, and women were, for the first time, explicitly barred from voting. There was no previous law which stated that women could not vote. The Great Reform Act enshrined it in law for the first time. Frankly, the Great Reform Act did such a minimal job that 2 more Reform Acts were passed within 50 years of this one, and then there was a further 2 more. The fact that Chartism and the suffragists/suffragettes arose from this law shows you how bad it did with enfranchisement. Now, I know what everyone is going to say, that I'm applying a present-day mindset to these laws. You are correct, I am. But the Whig interpretation does a much worse job by giving all of this way too much praise and seeing it as a linear line of progress. For more informed analysis, I would say that the idea of representation or democracy were not the same as in the present. In fact, democracy was a bit of a dirty word. There were still older ideas of representation that existed, which thought of the idea of 3 branches of representation: the monarch, the aristocracy, and the people, which essentially meant the upper middle class. This meant that the poor and the workers and women were not considered the people at this time. So that has to be taken into account. But yeah, these reforms are not great. it still left much to be desired. But Whig historians also speak of another impact of these changes, among others, in that it removed corruption and special interests for a more unfeeling, stricter bureaucracy that we see in the present day. Once again, this is a very misleading interpretation of what actually happened. Philip Harling makes one of the strongest arguments in my view, in that he sees that the idea of what was called old corruption of that day didn't really exist as it was represented in the radical press of the time. Rather, the reforms made were to remove the image of corruption, rather than corruption itself. So the image becomes less clear. It's more about image rather than looking at actual change. It was the veneer of change, which conservative thinkers were very wary of, being so anti-reform, or should I say, anti-radical reform. The image of corruption itself in this period is very difficult to pass through. But a former supervisor of mine, Professor Mark Knight, has given what I deem to be an excellent analysis of corruption in this period, and I really recommend you read his work to give a more full image. But I'll finish today with one other reform that came through in this period, which many don't talk about as much as I think they should. Now, if we cast our minds back to the start of this series, I did many interviews with people to get their general opinion on the press in the present. I also asked them to speak about the history that I'd be looking at. Now, I haven't played those clips in the past few episodes because many of them were not confident with their answers, and I decided not to include those clips. But generally, I think a lot of them gave some pretty good answers. And I will tell you one thing that interested me about these historical questions that I gave them. When I asked them to speak about Britain and the British Empire in this period, only a handful referenced Britain's involvement in slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. It was, in a way, a blind spot, and it got me quite confused. When you're asked about the history of America, most people would reference its history with the institution of slavery. But with Britain, it seems a bit more hidden. I would argue it's only really started coming into public discussion since the tearing down of the Edward Colston statue in Bristol back in 2020. But even then, the discussion died down very quickly. It was hurriedly swept back under the carpet. And it's not surprising to me. Nations don't like to speak of their dark past and the things it did which are abhorrent today. But the fact is that we, Britain, were one of the biggest beneficiaries of the slave trade, both during the slave trade and in how we used its abolition in our expansion of empire. And the economic angle is what many people focused on in the discussion of slavery in the abolition debates of the late 18th and early 19th century. Paula Dumas did an amazing PhD thesis on pro-slavery opinion in Britain in this period, and I want to contribute to that thesis by reading out a letter that I found the other day on this subject from 1789. And I want to include this because it's to really show how rife the debate was, and how we need to remember how visible slavery was for people in the British Isles at the time. We may like to ignore it now, but we were fully aware of its existence and how much we were gaining from it economically. This letter was written to the editor of The World, which is a newspaper that ran from 1787 to 1794 when it was merged with the Morning Post. It was a generally conservative newspaper which had a keen eye on the Hastings impeachment and claimed to have a strong circulation, especially among the who's who of Westminster. And this letter I'm about to read out was one of the times where the issue of slavery was raised in its pages. This was because debates on slavery were put forward to Parliament at this time by William Wilberforce, a very famous abolitionist. Someone decided to send a letter to the editor of this paper under the pseudonym of an Englishman and a man of humanity. This writer is concerned with abolition on humanitarian grounds, but is still in favour of maintaining the slave trade for the commercial and economic gain it brought for Britain and the colonies. And I'll leave with this extended quote to show you that colonial concerns were rife in politics. And through this one example among many others, was linked to the domestic issues of the time, but it also spans all of the topics I've covered today. Religion, reform, politics, the parties, they are all involved in this link. They are all involved in this. And I quote, "To those who have been most zealous in bringing forward this business, much praise is due. The motive is surely a laudable one, could it be carried into effect, but my residence in the West Indies convinces me that nothing is to be gained on the score of humanity, but much to be lost to the colonies in Great Britain. Those who know the subject will believe what I now assert to be a fact. The experiment will be dangerous. Great events have been produced from less causes, even in our day. If Mr. Wilberforce carries this motion, I should be glad to know what is to become of our settlements on the coast of Africa. Are they to be given with the trade to foreign nations who have so long wished for it? Generous and humane people! What compensation is to be made to the nation at large for the loss of so much trade and commerce? And what return to Liverpool for a total loss of their trade? I likewise wish to be informed. What will become of the several hundred sail of vessels, their builders, sailmakers, rope makers, etc.? What other market will be found for our Indian goods? Even Mr. Wilberforce, whose character I respect, I have great reliance upon for his humanity, which he comes to consider how many thousands are to be affected by his intended motion. But above all, the chief dependence is to be placed on the opposition that will be made by the commercial part of the kingdom, the wisdom of Parliament, and at last the good sense of the nation." End quote. It's damning. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Same Old News. As I said at the top of the episode, this is the last episode of the season. This season has really laid the groundwork for what I hope to do in the coming second season. I will be taking a couple of months to do some deeper research and hopefully be back with some really interesting stories from this period and the newspaper editors, contributors and publishers for you all to enjoy. In the meantime, please do follow our socials in the description down below to keep updated on when Season 2 will be released. I will be doing updates from time to time, so I'd love to see you there. Also, most importantly, please give us a rating or a like and subscribe depending on where you're listening. It really does mean a lot to me and helps keep this content coming out. In the meantime, I shall be back soon, and I will see you then for the same old news. Thank you for listening, and I'll be back soon.
MC. No,